This June day seemed to Frances Myles very much like any other day in Oxford. She walked along Jowett Walk, watching the gentle 5 o'clock sun bring out the bronze in the leaves overhead. This was her favourite part of the road leading to her husband's college. She quickened her pace. She was probably late again. She hoped, guiltily, that Richard would have enough work to occupy him while he waited for her. He generally had, but it was difficult to hurry on a day like this. There were so many things to enjoy, like the shades of green all around her, or the patterns of the cut stones in the high walls. Little things. But then the last few months had made the little things important. She entered Holywell, and hurried along its curve of old houses until she reached the Broad. There her pace slackened again, and she halted at a bookseller's window. Richard's new book on English lyric poetry was well displayed. It was selling, too, which had been a pleasant surprise. A selling book would be a help towards another summer among the mountains. Another summer, or a last summer, she wondered, and turned away from the window. Once all you had to do was to decide what mountains you'd like to climb and then spend the winter writing reviews and articles to cover the train fare. And there you were. But each year it was becoming more difficult. She thought of past summers in the Tyrol, in the Dolomites. There had been singing and dancing and light-hearted talk and friendly laughter. But now there were uniforms and regulations, self-consciousness and uncertainty. Now conversations with foreigners were apt to end in arguments. Richard had discussed all this with her last night before they fell asleep. He had voted for one last look at Europe in peacetime, such as it was. There were still countries where one could breathe as one liked. Perhaps the premonition that this day was very unlike any other summer day for Frances Myles had laid its cold finger on her heart. Or it may have been the thought of Oxford, as it might easily become, next term. At any rate, the lightness had gone out of her step. The young college porter was standing at the lodge gate. She tried to make her smile brighter than she felt. "How's the new baby?" she asked. "Just splendid, Mum, thank you. Mr. Myles is waiting in his room. He just phoned down to ask if you'd arrived. I'll tell him you're here." He moved back into the lodge. Frances remembered he had joined the Territorial Army in March, just after the seizure of Prague. Nowadays she kept remembering details like that. She hurried through the quadrangle and began the climb to Richard's room. She thumped on the door. Richard opened it, smiling with that guess-what look. "We've a visitor, Fran." It was Peter. Peter Galt. He grinned and held out both hands. "Hello, Frances. You look quite startled." "Peter, but we thought you were in Bucharest. When did you get back?" 2 or 3 weeks ago. I would have written you if I could. I've just been explaining to Richard. I've purposely not written you, and I'm not staying with you either." Frances turned to her husband in dismay. "Richard, what's the matter with him?" Richard handed her a glass of sherry. He refilled Peter's glass and then his own with maddening concentration before he spoke. "Peter got into a jam." "A jam? Peter?" She sat down on the nearest chair. She looked so charmingly anxious that Peter hastened to reassure her. "Don't worry, Frances. It all turned out rather well in the end. But it did make it necessary for me to be recalled." He grinned and added, "Ill health, of course." "Of course." Frances was less alarmed, but she was still curious. She waited for an explanation. It was Richard who came forth. "He got entangled with a spy." I hope she was beautiful, Frances said. I mean, if you will do things like that, you may as well make the most of it. She smiled as she said it. She had always hoped that Peter would never get entangled with anyone who wasn't beautiful. Unfortunately, it was a he, said Peter. And, to be quite truthful, he got entangled with me. You look such easy meat, really, Peter. That was an asset. And so you had to come back to England? Frances was still unable to take Peter quite seriously. He isn't after your blood, is he? He can't do that. Bucharest dealt with him. But his friends might think I learned too much before that happened. But, Peter, you don't mix that kind of politics with diplomacy, do you? He did the mixing. Now I am waiting for all the commotion to die down. Peter gave a good imitation of his old smile. But Frances, watching his eyes, was already revising her opinion about this visit. Something serious was behind it all. When she spoke, her voice had dropped all hint of teasing. Is that all? Richard gave a laugh. Out with it, Peter. It's no good being diplomatic with Frances. She can see through a brick wall as quickly as anyone. Peter finished his sherry. As he looked from Frances to Richard, he seemed to be making up his mind about something. His fingers played nervously with the sherry glass. He was choosing his next words with care. Frances is right. I'm not in the Foreign Office any longer. I've been put on to other work. I'm afraid this visit combines business with pleasure, and we haven't much time. I'll just have to start the story and hope for the best. I have a job for you, and I hope you'll agree to do it. It shouldn't be dangerous, tiresome perhaps, but not dangerous. He shot a quick glance at Richard. You're just the people we need for it. You're both above any suspicion, and you've a good chance of getting through. Richard looked at Peter speculatively. What on earth is it? He asked. The whys and wherefores can wait until the end. I'm sorry if it develops into a kind of lecture, but I'd like you to get all the details quite straight. Richard nodded. The job is simply this. I've been hoping that you would go abroad as usual this summer, and that you'd travel by Paris, meet a man there, and then continue the journey as he directs. At the end of it, you should be able to send us information which we need very badly. That's the general outline. Now here are the particulars. I'll give you no trimmings, just the facts. When you get to Paris, just do as you always do for some days, long enough to establish your innocent tourist reputation, and then on Saturday night, visit the Café de la Paix. Sit at an outside table towards the left. Order Cointreau with your coffee. Frances will be wearing a red rose. Don't notice anyone or anything in particular. About 11 o'clock, Richard will upset his Cointreau. He will be glad of an excuse not to drink it anyway, if I know Richard. Your waiter will come and mop it up. That and the red rose are the signal. A man will approach your table, and that's the moment for one of you to speak. The sentence should begin, Mrs. Rose told us we must see... and add the name of some place you've decided on. Keep it all natural, but be on guard for the number which the man will give you somehow. That's the key of this whole business. For if you go next day to the place which you mentioned at exactly 1 hour later than the number which he gives you, you will get into real touch with him. And he has a message for you. Have you got all that, Richard? Yes, but before we go any further, why choose us? There must be something fairly involved at stake, and it seems to me as if you needed someone with quick wits. I don't know if mine have been sharpened well enough. As for Fran... Frances only looked amused. Darling, I love you, she said. Go on, Peter. Peter took her advice. The message will direct you to another agent, and he will direct you further still, and you will find yourself passed on from agent to agent until you reach the chief of them. He's the last one on the line. and he's the chap we're worried about." He paused and watched Richard pour some sherry into his glass. Frances had the feeling that he was once more weighing his words very carefully before he spoke. "I think you'll find the rest of this travel-log more interesting. You've heard of what is called the Underground Railway in Germany, haven't you? It helps anti-Nazis to escape and covers up their tracks. One of the brains behind it is the chief of this group of agents. Until about 5 weeks ago we had the normal reports from him, accurate and regular. But since then we've had no really informative messages. 2 of them, in fact, were dangerously misleading. Fortunately, we had other sources of information which made us suspicious. These suspicions were increased when 2 men escaping from Germany by his route disappeared completely. They have simply vanished into thin air." Frances put aside her glass and leaned forward, cupping her face in her hands. "What we want to know is this. Does the man still exist? Or has he been sending us false messages to warn us that things aren't just right? Or has he been liquidated? Your job is to follow the route until you find him. The one clue I do know is that he will be an Englishman, the only Englishman in the chain of agents. I can't help with his name or appearance because he has too many of both." "Why doesn't the Paris man direct us to him straight away?" asked Richard. "The plan is his," Peter replied. "He invented it to suit his own particular work. It's been foolproof for a longer time than most systems. Anyone who wants to get in touch with him must begin at the Paris end, and no one can begin unless he knows how to make the difficult contact with the agent there. Anything which strikes you?" Richard hesitated. "The system is obviously pretty safe, except for one drawback. If the chief man himself is caught, then all information travelling out to him will get into the wrong hands. His agents might even be picked off one by one if he were persuaded into confession. Not to mention the fate of the poor devils who thought they were escaping from Germany." "Exactly. That's why the job has got to be done." "I still think you need a professional man on the job," Richard said gloomily. It was a good sign, thought Peter, that Richard was still arguing about it. He was clearly not very much in love with the idea, but he was still at the stage of objections rather than refusal. People changed, and being a don at Oxford might very well make you too contented, too unwilling to act against your own security. Richard was waiting for his answer. "We sent one," Peter said briefly. "We should have heard from him by this time. When we didn't, I suggested that we should try an amateur. A couple of innocents abroad might be able to get through all suspicion. The thing to remember is that you are not agents. Don't let yourself get mixed up in any sideline snooping. If the trail gets too hot, then just pull out. If there's any questioning, stick to your story. 2 holidaymakers having their annual trip. When you've finished, wire to this address in Geneva. Memorize it, then destroy it. If you find your man, wire arriving Monday or whatever day you saw him. If you don't, wire cancel reservations. Is that clear?" Richard's tone was grim. "I've got it memorized, if that's what you mean, but look, don't you think I'd better go alone? I'm not running Frances into any risks." Frances looked at him suddenly. When she spoke, her voice was low, but determined. "Richard, I am not going to be left behind." "Unfortunately, I agree with Frances," said Peter. "Since you've been married, you've never separated on your holidays, and you'll be safer with Frances because you won't take risks if she is with you." He looked at Richard. "I know it's going to ruin your summer," he began, and then stopped. He'd said enough as it was. "It isn't the ruining of it," said Richard slowly. "Everyone's holidays are ruined this year, but I don't think we'd really be of any use." Peter was picking up his gloves and umbrella and his black hat. He was still watching Richard intently. Something seemed to decide him. He moved over to Frances to say goodbye. "I would never have asked you if the whole thing wasn't so urgent, Richard. I didn't enjoy asking you, I may as well say. For God's sake, take care of yourselves." Peter's voice was normal again by the time he had reached the door. "I see I've kept you late for Frame's party. Goodbye, Frances. Goodbye, Richard. See you when you get back." The door closed softly and left a silent room. The party in Frame's rooms had just reached the right temperature when Frances and Richard arrived. Their host, armed with sherry bottles, pushed his way through to meet the latecomers. "I'm so glad," he breathed. "Sorry about this awful crowd, such a mob." Actually, thought Frances, this wasn't one of those ghastly affairs where you only knew the host. She smiled goodbye to Richard, who had already seen 2 men he wanted to talk to. Frances waited in the corner she had chosen for herself as 3 young men gravitated towards her. They arrived from their various directions and began one of the usual adroit conversations which sherry parties inspire. This was perhaps the last conversation they would have together for a long time, and they wanted to keep it gay. They discussed the Picasso exhibition in London and Guernica, and that led to Catalonian art and Dali. Frances remembered a chapter somewhere by Evelyn Waugh on Gaudi's telephone kiosks. It was an amusing description, and they laughed. "Eternal Oxford," came a voice. "How delightful it is to return and be so far removed from the rigours of life." The voice had a very pronounced, almost too careful Oxford accent. The speaker was tall and remarkably good-looking. A duelling scar marked his chin, another his cheek. They gave his blondness a certain formidable quality. "Mrs. Myles, lovely as ever." He bowed very low over Frances's hand. "Oh, hello, how are you?" said Frances, collecting herself and making hasty introductions. "This is Freiherr Sigurd von Aschenhausen. He was an undergraduate along with Richard." The 3 undergraduates maintained a polite smile in place. Frances knew they were placing his date of residence at the university very accurately. The conversation limped along, the undergraduates hoping that von Aschenhausen would go, but he didn't. Frances did her best, as she talked about summer holidays, explaining that Richard and she would like to have their usual view of the mountains. "Where exactly were you thinking of going?" asked von Aschenhausen. "We were in the South Tyrol last year. I'd like to get back there just once more." Frances's voice was honey-sweet. "Just before the volcano erupts." The Englishman smiled grimly. The German protested politely. "What with this peaceful England? There will be no war, no general war. Just look at everyone in this room." Unconsciously he straightened his back as he looked around. "And there's not a soldier among you," was the implication. One of the young men spoke up. "There's a limit to everything, you know." "Goodbye, Frances. I must go now. Have a good time this summer." The others had to go now too, it seemed. Von Aschenhausen remained. Frances shook herself free from embarrassment. After all, he used to be amusing and gay. He had made many friends when he was up at Oxford. She wondered how he was getting along in the new Germany. He used to laugh off any political discussion by protesting that he wasn't interested in politics. She racked her brains for something tactful to say. It was difficult in this summer of 1939. You were so conscious of nationality now. "I'm afraid that young man did not like me," said von Aschenhausen. "Is it because I am German, or is it his usual manner? It is really very sad for a German to find how misjudged and abused his country is. Of course our enemies control the press in foreign countries. They have clever tongues." "Have they? It is strange, though, how criticism of Germany has grown even in countries which were really very close to her. I wonder how it could have happened." Frances gazed at him steadily, with wide blue eyes. He looked as if he didn't know quite how he should take that. "I suppose you will now lecture me on the wickedness of Germany's claims to natural Lebensraum. It's easy to talk when you have a large empire." "On the contrary, Herr von Aschenhausen, I like to think of all people having their Lebensraum, whether they are Germans or Jews or Czechs or Poles." His voice grated. He was really angry. "It is just such thoughts as these which have weakened Britain. She weakens herself all the time, yet calls it improvement." "Hello, you're being very serious in this corner." It was Richard. "I've been having a lesson in statecraft," said Frances, conscious of Richard's eye on the 2 pink spots on her cheeks. I shouldn't let myself get angry, she thought, and listened to von Aschenhausen once more, smiling and plausible. She had the feeling that he was trying to cover up, as if he were annoyed with the impression he had given her. He was very polite as they said goodbye. He bowed low, his composure regained. "I hope we meet again," he said. The rest of the week passed quickly. Frances was busy with the closing of their house. She also made a hectic dash to London for some clothes she simply must have. Richard finished the odds and ends of work which face a tutor towards the end of term. But from Peter Galt they heard nothing. "Which means we are to go ahead," said Richard at breakfast on Wednesday. That morning they bought their tickets to Paris and interviewed the bank about a supply of travellers' cheques and some French money. The expense of their unknown journeys had worried him, but his bank manager met him with a discreet smile. The bank had been authorised to give Mr. Myles a letter of credit. Richard did not ask who had authorised it. The bank manager treated it all as something merely routine. In the evening, Richard hunted through his bookshelves and picked out the Baedekers and maps. He spread them out around him as he sat and wondered which he could omit. Surely the Pyrenees or Mallorca would be unnecessary. Peter had hinted in the direction of Central Europe. Still, it was better to be safe. He knew his way about these maps, and they ought to go along, all of them. He would take fewer clothes if his suitcase got too crowded. Frances came in, her hair brushed loosely to her shoulders. "Don't overwork, darling," she said with mock concern. She looked at the notebook in her hand and checked off the items she had written there. Richard watched her as she bit her lip and counted. He felt that wave of emotion which came to him when he looked at Frances in her unguarded moments. And he had the bleak horror which always attacked him when he thought how easy it might have been never to have met her. Frances straightened. "That's that," she said. "Just my own things to pack tomorrow, after Arnie departs. There goes the best cook we shall ever have. She seems to feel she will never be back here. It was really rather painful this evening. I've got just as much attached to her as she has to us. She wants her father's farm to have the honour of a visit from the gnädige Frau and the Herr Professor if they should visit Innsbruck this summer." "Her people were pro-Dollfuss, weren't they?" asked Richard. "They were. I have a feeling that they have changed. Annie has been very silent about them since she returned last year. One thing she did tell me, her sister told her that if she came back to England and a war broke out, that she would be stoned to death. That's what they said we did in 1914. Isn't it appalling? Well, I suppose if a nation allows concentration camps, it will find it hard to believe that other people don't use similar methods. Cheer up, old girl. Who cares what a lot of uncivilized people think anyway?" "Sorry, darling, I'm tired and depressed. I worry and worry inside me, and I think everyone else is doing the same. It's difficult to forget what we all went through last September." "Yes, it's difficult," he said slowly. "I shan't forget helping to dig trenches in the parks, or the paper tape on all the windows, or the towels we were told to keep beside a bucket of water. All the time I was digging, I kept wondering whether the trenches would be any good at all, and I knew they wouldn't be. But what else was there? And then bastards like von Aschenhausen come along, all smiles and bows, and wonder why people are not enthusiastic about them. They blackmailed us with bombers one year and go back on their agreement they had extorted out of us, and then expect to be welcomed as friends, all within 9 months. All that, Frances, makes one of the reasons why I listened to Peter. If I could put out a spoke of even the most microscopic size in the smallest Nazi wheel, I'd think it a pretty good effort. He had risen and was pacing up and down the study. "Don't you try to leave me at home," interrupted Frances. "I'm coming. Richard, my dear, we'll go to Paris, and I'll wear a red rose for 3 nights, and you'll spill Cointreau until the whole cafe is gaping at us, and then we'll go on holiday, wondering if Peter's sense of humour has become overdeveloped since Bucharest." Richard laughed. "You sound almost convincing, Frances. But this is no picnic." She rose from the floor and went over to the window. It was wide open. She leaned forward to breathe in the dewy smell of the earth. The lilac trees at the end of the garden had silver leaves. Richard came to her and slipped an arm around her waist. They stood there in silence, watching a garden moonlit. "We should photograph this in our memory," he said at last. "We may need to remember it often for the next few years." Frances nodded. Around them were the other gardens, the mixed perfume of flowers. The walls hung heavy with roses and honeysuckle, their colours whitened in the moonlight. The deep shadows of trees, blurring the outline of the other houses, were pierced, here and there, with the lights from uncurtained windows. The giant elms in the Magdalen Deer Park stood sentinels of peace. "It's funny, Richard. I really am tired, and there's a nice large bed waiting for me upstairs, and yet I keep staying out here, looking at the stars." "I hate to be unromantic, but I do think it is time we got some sleep. Tomorrow's a bad day." Frances smiled and felt Richard's arm around her waist. On the stairs, he stopped to kiss her. "That's to break the enchantment," he said. His lips were smiling, but his eyes were the way Frances loved them most. There was always a feeling of excitement after the unpleasantness of a channel crossing. Frances glanced at Richard opposite her, leaning back with his eyes closed. He was a bad sailor. The last passengers boarded the train on the Dieppe siding. The confusion along the corridors was subsiding, and 2 young men halted at their compartment. "This will do," said one, after hardly seeming to glance in their direction. They swung their rucksacks onto the rack. Undergraduates, thought Frances, as she looked at her magazine. The train travelled gently along the street like a glorified tramcar. Frances discarded her magazines. It was almost impossible to read on a foreign train. The differences in houses and people, in fields and gardens, fascinated her. She looked at Richard. He was staring gloomily at the fields, making up his mind to move. As he caught her glance, he roused himself. "Come on, Frances, tea or something. You've eaten nothing since breakfast, and I haven't even that now." In the corridor, Richard squeezed her arm. "Excited?" he teased. Frances smiled back. It was like being a child again when a deep secret churned in your stomach. She remembered Richard's words last night. "Keep cool, don't worry, we won't lose by being careful." The certainty of the words panicked her. She suddenly knew that Richard and she had never been so alone before in all their lives. Richard was talking continuously as if he had sensed her stage fright. She concentrated on listening to him. He had helped her this way before, like the time she had climbed her first mountain and had got badly stuck. Richard had talked so calmly that she forgot her fear, and her feet followed his to safety. People were now crowding into the restaurant car. "Let's move," said Richard. In their compartment, the two young men uncrossed their legs to let Frances and Richard pass. Frances had the feeling they were interrupting a discussion. She didn't look at them, concentrating instead on the fields, trying to resist the feeling of sleep which the train invited. When she awoke, they were in Paris. The undergraduates were leaving, and they said goodbye. Richard was smiling. "Had a good sleep?" "Marvellous. Did I make any peculiar noises?" "No, you slept like a child. It quite won all our hearts." A bulky shadow fell across the doorway. It belonged to a man with a neat black beard and neat black suit, a suitcase in each hand. Richard didn't seem aware of him. He chose this moment to ask, "What about dinner at the Café Voltaire tonight?" Frances was enthusiastic, her clear voice carrying well down the corridor. "Oh, yes, and we'll have decent Vouvray." The platform was remarkably crowded, thought Richard, his eyes searching for the two young Englishmen. He saw them striding towards the main entrance. Behind them, at some distance, was a fat black figure, carrying 2 bags. Richard felt a sudden wave of relief. In the taxi, he avoided discussing anything except the streets and the buildings. Their hotel was one of the small ones on the left bank. Frances was already in the bathroom, unpacking toothbrushes. "You've too much damned energy," said Richard. "That sleep on the train made me all right," she said. "Speaking of the train, who were your young friends?" Richard began to tell his story. The 2 young men had been undergraduates, Cambridge men. The fair-haired man had said something about Czechoslovakia, but the dark one had shut him up rather abruptly. What had actually started them talking was the man in the black suit. He had passed the compartment twice each time, looking benevolently at Frances, asleep in the corner seat. "And that," said Richard, "aroused all our protective instincts and broke the ice. Mostly the fair-haired glamour boy talked about his brother, Thornley, who was up at Oxford in my time, a friend of Peter Galt's." At the mention of Peter's name, Frances had stiffened. She didn't like it, somehow, and for all Richard's calm, she knew he didn't either. June ended with their first week in Paris. They were very much on holiday. They rose late and breakfasted at their open window. An insignificant little man had watched them from the shadows of his room since their first morning, but his interest was waning. He wasn't a romantic, and the appearance each morning of a pretty blonde girl in a dressing gown pouring coffee was beginning to bore him. He was wasting his time, he thought angrily, as he watched them leave their room after midday, as they always did. Let someone else take care of them. The second insignificant man who took over at this point was equally bored. His feet hurt. They followed Frances and Richard from one church to another, from exhibition to exhibition, from palaces to slums. Towards the end of the week, he too had become convinced he was wasting his time. The third insignificant man who joined Richard and Frances while they were having dinner had slightly better luck. He liked theatres and nightclubs. He was the only one of the insignificant men who was sorry to receive instructions at the end of the week to switch over to a newly arrived American. He would not have been surprised to see Richard and Frances approach the Café de la Paix on Saturday night, and would have approved of Frances's small white hat, with its gay red rose, perched over her right eye. Frances was nervous, so she talked constantly as they walked up the Avenue de l'Opéra. "I've enjoyed this week, even if my feet feel 2 sizes bigger." Richard nodded. "It hasn't been so bad. Life has been simpler than I thought it would be. I begin to feel I was over-suspicious of Blackbeard." "I haven't seen him again, have you?" "No, nor any possible relatives either." which would have pleased the insignificant men. They had arrived between the dinner and the after-theatre crowds. There were a few vacant tables. Richard led the way to one on the left-hand side. As they sat down, a waiter appeared, like the traditional white rabbit out of a hat. "Coffee and 2 Cointreau," said Richard. They settled comfortably in their chairs, and Frances sipped her Cointreau. A large, expensively draped woman made her way with difficulty past their table, sending Richard's coffee swilling into the saucer and the liquor trickling over the side of the table. The waiter staged his arrival from nowhere. He wiped and apologised with equal vigour. Frances sat very still. She was conscious of the smile on her lips which had settled there and wouldn't come off, as if she were having her photograph taken. She watched a man make his way out of the restaurant. Richard's back was turned towards him, and he hadn't noticed him yet. He was almost behind the waiter. Richard was watching her. He was waiting. "I was telling you about Mrs. Rose," Frances said, flipping her cigarette case open. "She told me to be sure to go to Le Lapin Agile. Mrs. Rose said we would like it." The waiter became aware of the man trying to edge impatiently past him. He stepped aside, knocking the man's elbow. The man dropped a cigarette on their table and caught it as it rolled. There was just time for them to notice the peculiar way he wore the watch on his wrist, and the peculiar time it showed on its clearly marked face. It was hot and stuffy in the room, but Richard wouldn't open the windows before they went to sleep. He held her close to him, her body tense with worry. "What's wrong, Fran?" "Someone has been meddling with my things. The cream jars were in the wrong order. You know how I always have them arranged in a certain way." "Is anything missing?" "My address book. The little one I keep for hotels or hairdressers in any place we've stayed abroad." "That won't be much help to them." "But who are they?" "God knows. It might be friends of Blackbeard, or it might be someone who followed Peter more successfully than he thought. Our room has been searched, but there's nothing incriminating to find. They can watch and follow us about until they're blue in the face." "You sound confident." "The chap we met tonight seemed pretty calm and collected. He made everything look quite simple. Damned clever, too. 1 cigarette, and then, as neat emphasis, the watch he wore the wrong way round, so that we could see that it had stopped at 1 o'clock. I rather liked that touch." Frances stifled a yawn against his shoulder, and was asleep by the time Richard had opened the windows and let the night air surge in with its welcome coolness. He lay and watched the blackness of the courtyard bleach to grey, and felt the coldness of early morning strike his bare shoulders. A sudden coolness had come to the city. Frances shivered as she stepped out of the taxi. Behind her, withdrawing into the shadows, was Le Lapin Agile. Nothing had changed since they had last been here. It never did. At first, Richard couldn't see anyone remotely like their friend at Café de la Paix. He looked at his watch. Time enough. His eyes naturally travelled across the room. He couldn't be sure, but something about one of the men at the table at the end of the room seemed familiar. A girl entered, carrying a guitar. The many voices of the crowded room faded. Frances looked at the silent faces. She wondered how many of them hid the thoughts of uniforms. It may have been the low, sweet voice of the singer, or the simplicity of the music, but she felt her heart stifle. In it there were tears for the courage of ordinary people, hot rage against the disturbers of their lives. Richard's hand lay on her arm. "Steady," he said. There was something as well as gentleness in his voice. "I'm afraid we must leave," he explained, and led the way. The man from the Café de la Paix had just 3 minutes' start. They left as slowly as would seem natural, but the man had completely disappeared. They went down the steep steps. It had begun to rain. Richard swore softly. Frances knew then that something had gone wrong, and then the door behind them opened, and there was a path of light over the wet pavement. It was the man. "Monsieur has left behind his book," he said, and handed something to Richard. "Oh yes, careless of me, thank you very much." It was a small book, and fitted into his pocket neatly. The man gave an easy wave of the hand, and was already back in the shelter of the doorway. When they reached their hotel room, Richard settled the lamp beside the bed and opened the book. It was a guide to southern Germany. He began at the first blank pages and examined each successive page carefully for any markings. His care was rewarded. There was a small, lightly pencilled star opposite the section on Marienstrasse, Nuremberg, and next to it a name, A. Fugger. A telephone book in Nuremberg would probably give the number of Fugger's house in Marienstrasse, but how to identify themselves when they met Herr Fugger? He read on. There had to be some other clue. Among the last blank pages he found a red rose petal, neatly pressed. On the back of the page were some music notes, roughly jotted. The simple tune was clearly recognisable. He relaxed back on his pillow and smiled amiably at the ceiling. It was very late when they arrived at Nuremberg. The porter found them a taxi and gave the driver the name of the hotel. They sat in silence during the short journey. "You could have walked," said the driver as they got out of the taxi. He seemed as if he disapproved of their extravagance. Frances was still silent as they reached their room. "Cheer up, old girl," said Richard. "You'll feel better in the morning." "I hope," she added to herself. But when morning came, and the constant hum of traffic outside their window awoke Frances, she did feel better. They had breakfast in their room, and discussed their plans as they ate. Richard had decided to work in an opposite direction from their Paris experience. Instead of waiting a few days, they would call on Fugger tomorrow, and then they could spend 3 or 4 days playing the tourist in Nuremberg. There was that feeling of continual coming and going in the entrance hall which characterises a busy town hotel. The other guests were mostly German. Richard noted the number of uniforms of one kind or another, and even the quick, precise salutes and the violent two-worded greeting. It was astounding, because it was so theatrical, so incongruous in a peaceful hotel lobby. As they reached the front door, Frances paused to look at the roughly paved street, and then at her shoes. "I thought the heels were a mistake," said Richard. Frances looked stubborn. "Well, if I change into my hiking shoes, I'll have to change my whole outfit." A young man had come out of the hotel door. He halted as he heard Frances's voice, and looked at her, giving what Hollywood has perfected as the double take. Then the pavement was crowded with the stamp of heavy boots. Frances stepped backwards to the safety of the doorway and felt her heel sink cruelly into something soft. The young man winced, but stood his ground. "I'm so sorry," Frances said. "Pardon me," the young man said, lifting his hat and trying to walk away without limping. "You surpassed yourself there, my sweet," remarked Richard. "Now we can start in the old town. Keep your eyes open." Frances remembered the name he had told her last night. She guessed that Richard had the idea that Fugger might be the name of some business, for there had been no Fugger of Marienstrasse in the telephone directory, and so the only way to find Mr. Fugger was to explore Marienstrasse themselves. They walked along slowly and covered 2/3 of the street. Then Frances suddenly felt Richard's hand tighten. They stopped at a small bookseller's shop with a narrow window space and doorway, completely overshadowed by the larger, more prosperous buildings on either side. Above the door, in small, neat white lettering, was a name, A. Fugger. Inside the shop, A girl with glasses on was working with scissors and paste. She had a white face and dull blue eyes. Her hair tightened back so ruthlessly that it hurt Frances to look at it. The girl looked up expectantly as the door creaked shut behind them. Frances had the feeling she was disappointed. She left her work reluctantly and came forward with no smile on her pale lips. Richard explained that he was looking for a certain collection of early German lyrics. The girl had never heard of it. "Is there anyone here who does know about German lyric poetry?" said Richard, raising his voice. The door at the back of the shop opened. A short, stout man entered. He was in his shirt sleeves, and he mopped his brow with a handkerchief. He had shut the door behind him, but not before Richard had smelled something burning. Paper, could it be? The small man looked at the girl in some irritation as he said, "I thought I heard customers, Ottilie." He turned his back on her abruptly and listened to Richard's questions. The bookseller was interested, and his eyes fixed on the red rose of Frances's hat. "Ah, there's music here," said Frances with charming surprise. She picked up a large green volume titled Songs of All Nations. She turned quickly to a page which the index had numbered, and smoothed down the page so that both men could see the song title clearly. The bookseller's eyes flickered as they read, "Oh, my love's like a red, red rose." "Do you like to sing?" Frances asked the girl. Ottilie shrugged her shoulders, and then suddenly became aware that the two men had gone to the far corner of the room. "Well, do you?" Frances asked again. The girl said, "Sometimes." She looked as if she were going to follow the men. "Do you like Mozart, or do you prefer Wagner?" continued Frances relentlessly. "Wagner," replied Ottilie. If eyes could poison, I am already writhing on the ground, thought Frances. At that moment, the bookseller was shaking his head sadly. His voice was clear. "No, I'm afraid it's gone. If you cannot find it, then come and see us again. Good day," he said suddenly, and walked with quick, short steps to the back room. And then the front door swung open. It opened with such terrific violence that the hinges shrieked a protest which made Frances jump. 3 large men strode in. Richard could have sworn that there was almost an approach to a smile on Ottilie's face. She gestured quietly towards the back door. The men drew their revolvers. The leader turned the handle of the door and then kicked it open. But there were no shots, no voices. Frances found herself breathing again. "What's wrong?" she asked. The men filed out of the back room. Their self-assurance was replaced by bad temper. "Where is he?" the leader snapped. The girl's smile faded. Contempt gave way to fear. "He went in there." She pointed to the back room. "There is no way out." "There is a window, fool. Who are these?" He nodded towards Frances and Richard. "What do you want here?" Richard looked surprised, and then let the right tone of slight annoyance creep into his voice as he answered. He was explaining at some length that they had tried 2 other bookshops and had failed in their search for this book, that they had been directed to the smaller second-hand dealers, and the book was still unfound. It dawned on Frances that A. Fugger was gaining some very valuable minutes. It seemed to dawn on their leader, too. "That is all," the Nazi said irritably. "We shall find you at the hotel if there is anything else we need to know." The arm shot out. The heels clicked. The magic words were invoked. Richard and Frances bowed and said good day, gravely. They walked back to the old town at a medium pace. They didn't see anyone following them, but probably someone would. When they got to their hotel, Frances went upstairs to change her gloves. Richard sat in the entrance hall and looked through a Nuremberg paper. It seemed as if the inhuman Poles and the wicked Jews were behaving with abominable, not-to-be-tolerated cruelty to the Germans who were living in Poland. The editorial worked itself up into a fine lather. It made crude reading, and by the time Frances came downstairs, he was very bored. He looked at her and was instantly aware that something had happened. She surprised him by suddenly kissing him, but it brought her close enough for him to hear the word searched, spoken with motionless lips. So they had taken advantage of their slow return to the hotel, as he had hoped they might. He returned her kiss and said, "Good." "Let's eat," Frances suggested. "I'm ravenous." They found a restaurant near at hand where they had their late lunch. They ate it leisurely and sat smoking their cigarettes long after Richard had paid the bill. The room had emptied, much to the annoyance of two uniformed men who were seated in one corner. As Richard said, it made things look a bit too obvious. "Time to leave," said Richard. "It might be good to visit the Berg this afternoon." Even if the men couldn't understand any English, at least the clearly spoken Berg would stick. They entered a tramcar which carried them westwards and then northwards round the whole town. They skirted the thick walls and their broad, dry moat, and at last reached the castle. "Are you sure you really want to see this?" he asked Frances. "It's full of frightfulness." "Why not? It's only an old prison tower with a torture chamber." A tall young man, standing morosely before an intricate object of spiked iron whose function had been to pierce and tear and burn all at the same time, turned as he heard her voice. There was a look of recognition on his face. "How's your foot?" Frances asked. "I'm really sorry. I assure you it isn't a habit of mine." "That's all right." His face relaxed, but he still didn't smile with any enthusiasm. "Enjoying this?" he added, with just the right note in his voice. Richard grinned. He liked this man. "Where's the way out?" he asked. The American smiled. "It's past the tower dungeons. You can't escape them." Frances looked at him. "Our name is Myles, by the way. Would you come and have something to drink? I'm parched." The American gravely acknowledged that he was parched too, and he knew of a good beer place just down the hill. They left the five-cornered tower. Outside it was pleasant to see the green trees and ordinary people looking neither efficient nor thorough. And then a detachment of troopers marched past them, their faces expressionless under their uniform caps. Frances felt her depression return. "You're looking very solemn," said the American. "Why did you come to Germany this year? At first I thought you might be here to worship at the shrine, but you seem to have the wrong reactions for that." Richard answered that. "Oh, the usual inquisitiveness. We wanted to see for ourselves. We haven't been in Germany proper since the new era got well underway. We thought this might be our last chance." They had reached the Rathauskeller, and the American hadn't any opportunity for further questions until they were settled at the table and beer was ordered for the men. Frances insisted on tea. She noted that her order gave the American some delight. "I suppose I ought to play true to form," she thought, "to keep up the national character." "By the way, we don't know your name yet," Frances said. "We can't go on just calling you the American." The man smiled and searched through his pocketbook for a card. "This makes it easier," he said. He was, they read, Henry M. Van Cortlandt from New York. He told them he was a newspaper man, now in assignment in Europe, looking for symptoms. "War?" asked Richard. "Perhaps. What do you think?" "I think if Poland or any other country is attacked, then it is the signal for any nation who doesn't want to become part of Germany to rouse itself. It may be the last chance." "And you think Britain is going to take off its nice clean coat and get its nose all bloodied up in defending Poland?" "A country fights for two things," said Richard. "For loot or survival. We'll fight along with our friends for survival." "But Britain's policy for the last years—" "I know," said Frances. "In America it is called isolationism. It hasn't worked, and we admit that." Van Cortlandt rose. "Sorry, I've got to see a man." Richard rose too. "We're sorry too. We shall see you again soon, I hope." "Yes." The American voice didn't seem overjoyed at the prospect. "Thanks for the beer. Goodbye." Frances looked after him sadly. Richard said, "Keep off politics after this, Frances, even if you feel you've got something approaching an answer. Now, what about something to eat, and then a movie, and then bed?" It was Frances who lay awake that night. She thought of the bookseller, of the tall American and the constant rhythm of marching boots. When she fell asleep, her thoughts were still with her, and chased her through the five-cornered tower. The American was there, observing everything, contenting himself with a sad smile when she took the wrong turning. There was no way out, and she was looking at the Iron Maiden, and the face was that of the girl, Ottilie, and the hands were real. The fingernails were long and pointed, and they were coloured blood red. Richard watched Frances closely. She had drunk several cups of tea and smoked 3 cigarettes. Whatever had disturbed her would gradually lose its detail if he didn't emphasize it by referring to it. He thought of something to do which would be interesting without being exciting. "What about the German Museum today? It should be innocuous, and you'll like the costume section." Frances nodded absently. She was wondering whether A. Fugger had escaped. If he had been caught, there would be, no doubt, some ingenious way of trying to make him talk. The silence in which they travelled to the museum was palpable. Their 2 watchdogs attached themselves at a reasonable distance. It seemed as if it didn't matter if they were noticeable. Frances thought this over. They had been so very obviously under watchful eyes, and their room had been so very obviously searched. She came to the conclusion that this might be an especially subtle technique. Perhaps they were supposed to feel persecuted, intimidated. But if the Nazis thought they were worth terrifying or trapping, they would surely not let them wander about for the next few days without some real shadow trailing them, someone who would do his job efficiently and secretly, who would keep after them. They were in the museum until it closed at 4 o'clock. After that, they both thought it a good idea to return to the hotel and rest before dinner. Richard thought he'd like a bath. He left the bathroom door open and cooled off in tepid water. This game is simple enough, he thought. The only real danger points were those at the actual contact with an agent. Well, the danger point in Nuremberg was past. It had passed when Fugger had spoken so softly that he had to strain to hear him. He had been looking down at the title page of a book, and the bookseller was searching through some other volume. "It is better in Innsbruck," Fugger had whispered. "The Gasthof Bozen, Herzog Friedrichstrasse 37, is recommended. The owner is called Hans and will help you. He likes music and red roses as we all do." Richard had the satisfactory feeling that A. Fugger had escaped his pursuers. He was too wily a bird not to have had all his preparations made, surely. After they had dressed, they went downstairs for dinner in the hotel. Many of the people in the restaurant turned their heads to watch the slender, fair-haired girl. She was easily the loveliest woman in the place, thought Richard, with justifiable pride. "That rest did you good, Frances," he said. "You mustn't worry about me," she said. "I'm just in the process of adjusting myself between 2 very different ways of life. I was thinking about the war, particularly, Richard. The more I see of Germany, the more I know that a showdown must come. When I think of the children leaving school each year, all of them carefully educated in the Nazi way, I honestly shudder to think what the rest of the world faces in 10 years' time. "It's extraordinary what people can swallow for the sake of their beliefs," said Richard. "I heard of a practicing surrealist who spent many months eating his wardrobe." "That sounds a good story," said a man's voice. Both Richard and Frances looked up in surprise. "Hello, Van Cortlandt. Glad to see you. May I come over here for a while?" "I'm sorry I got so hot and bothered yesterday in that discussion," said Frances quickly. "You know, it isn't easy for us British to look at these things disinterestedly. And I came over here because I began to feel I might have seemed too darn callous." "Well," said Richard, "now that we've all kissed and made friends, what will you have?" They all laughed, and Van Cortlandt said he would have a beer. "Now, would you really like to hear the story about the wardrobe?" They talked for an hour, and then decided to have a moonlight walk. Their bodyguards joined them outside the hotel, Richard noted. They didn't choose any particular way, but just followed any twisting street. In the narrower streets, where there were so few people, the men were ludicrously obvious. The American, after his first glance back at them, had ignored the 2 pairs of feet, keeping time with such perfect precision. Both Van Cortlandt and Richard were in good form. They talked with a good deal of fervour, and Frances was very well content to be the audience. Suddenly, from the quiet blackness, there came the high, self-strangling cry of fear and pain. They looked at one another. "And just what is that?" asked Richard quietly. "You stay here with your wife. I'll investigate." The American had taken a step, along with Richard, into the alley. "Halt!" the abrupt command came from behind them. Van Cortlandt and Richard stopped, looking belligerently at the 2 men running towards them. Frances came to the rescue. "Something's wrong!" she exclaimed. "A murder or something down there!" The brown-shirted men exchanged looks. "We advise you to take a walk," the older one said. "But something is wrong," the American protested. The trooper who was doing the speaking said, "We advise you to take a walk. It is only a Jew's alley." So that was it. There was a moment's silence, only broken by a faint moaning. Frances turned abruptly away. The others followed, and they heard the Germans laugh. They were silent until they were almost at the hotel, and then Van Cortlandt spoke. "That's it," he said savagely. "Just as you're enjoying yourself and thinking that life isn't so bad after all, you meet that. Blast them. 2 or 3 more days, and then I'm getting the hell out of here." They were silent again. All the charm of the night had been broken. As they said goodbye, Van Cortlandt gave them his card and wrote his New York business address on the back of it. They gave him their address in Oxford. "Tomorrow," Richard said firmly. "Tomorrow we leave." On Sunday the 9th of July, they arrived in Mittenwald and put up at the hotel where Richard had once stayed as an undergraduate. The owner of the hotel, Frau Koppler, sat in earnest conversation over a little table with her special friends. Richard remembered how shocked Frau Koppler had been when the undergraduates had preferred to drink their beer in the restaurant instead of in the room she had arranged for guests. Then one of the jokes had been that she was pro-Nazi and that she was plotting with her special friends at her exclusive table. Now it seemed as if the joke had become fact. Richard saw Frau Koppler look over to their table. It was noticeable that she had taken quite a lot of interest in their movements. She sat down with them, bowing as she did so. "I hope I'm not interrupting you," Frau Koppler began. "Are you enjoying your holiday?" Frances let Richard handle the greater part of the conversation. She wasn't quite sure, to begin with, why they were being honoured with a visit. It wasn't very much like Frau Koppler to unbend to any of her guests, particularly foreigners. "Have you stayed here before?" asked Frau Koppler. "Yes, it must have been almost 8 years ago. It was in the off-season, at the very end of September." "Ah, yes, I remember now. There were 9 students and 2 very young professors." She must have known all the time and verified his name from the visitor's record. "Yes," said Richard. "It was what we call a reading party." "Well, you see for yourselves that we are just the same, only so much happier." Richard said nothing. Frau Koppler looked at the large picture of the unhappy-looking man with the ridiculous moustache which hung prominently on the wall. "Thanks be to our leader," she said. "Do you not admire all he has done for us?" "The military roads are the best I've ever seen, and the buildings for speeches and political gatherings are very handsome," said Frances quietly. Frau Koppler turned to her with some annoyance. "And 100 other things," she said. "How long will you stay here?" The velvet glove was off. "I think we'll leave quite soon now. Perhaps you could advise us," said Richard. Frau Koppler gave the advice they wanted. "The train from here goes direct to Innsbruck. It is the centre of hundreds of excursions." "That sounds a very good idea," said Richard. "Thank you, Frau Koppler. You have been the greatest help." On Friday they arrived in Innsbruck, and succumbed, as they always did, to its outward charm. They left their luggage at the station and walked through busy streets bathed in soft yellow light. They crossed over into the narrow Herzog Friedrichstrasse with its arcades and balconies, and as they approached number 37, Richard took Frances's arm. They entered the insignificant doorway. The heavy door swung behind them, shutting them off from the cheery babble of the busy arcade. Frances gripped Richard with one arm and a bunch of roses in the other. As they moved towards the stairs, Frances broke off a red rose and fastened it through the buttonhole of her flannel suit. She wished she felt as confident as her heels sounded on the wooden staircase. It twisted in an uneven curve to the left, leading to the landing. There was a man at the desk watching them through his small, half-closed eyes. Like 2 bullet holes in a lump of dough, thought Frances as she waited for Richard to finish his arrangements with the fellow. The man handed Richard a key and abandoned them to a boy in a green apron who led the way. Their room faced the street and was pleasant in its simplicity. Frances went over to one of the windows. Along the street, the varied house fronts rose tall and narrow over the arcades where the shops hid. Someone was standing behind her. She turned quickly. Richard was gone. It was the boy in the green apron. He held out a vase of water to her and pointed to the flowers she still carried. "Where would the lady like the flowers?" "Could we move that small table near that mirror and place them there?" He approved of the decision and watched her arrange the flowers. "Very pretty, gracious lady." His brown eyes were friendly. "I shall go for the luggage now, and I shall come back with it as quickly as possible." "Thank you. What is your name?" "Johann, gracious lady." "Thank you, Johann." He paused at the door. "Is there anything the lady needs?" Frances shook her head, but he still stood at the door, his eyes watching the corridor. Suddenly, he turned with a smile. "Here is the gentleman," he said. "Good evening, gracious lady." "Good evening, Johann." So he had been staying with her until Richard came back, as a sort of watchdog. "Thank God for a friendly face and a kind word," said Richard as he entered the room. "Yes, I like Johann." "His name is Johann." Richard's voice had changed. "Johann, Hans, Johann... No, it probably wasn't. Probably." "What was Johann like?" Richard asked. "I noticed he hovered about here until I got back." "Polite, good manners, that's all. What people used to call a well-brought-up boy." "You know, I had the funniest feeling he didn't approve of this hotel. All I've seen so far are middle-aged men looking rather pleased with themselves. It may be one of those pubs where Nazi meetings were held secretly when Austria was still banning them. Perhaps we've arrived in the middle of a reunion of some kind. That's cheery, I must say. Frances noted that he looked strained. What about a spot of food? She smiled as she saw him brighten at the idea. As they went downstairs, Richard was whistling to himself in a preoccupied way. As they reached the desk, Frances realised that the last few bars had taken shape into something she knew. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose. Richard was laying their key in front of the large, shapeless man. He grunted in reply to their good evening, and only looked a moment at Frances's buttonhole. When they returned that evening, climbing slowly up the stairs, they braced themselves to face the desk, but no one was there. Just as Richard was wondering if he should risk getting their room key, Johann appeared. Herr Kronsteiner had just gone to have his supper, he explained, and moved round the desk for their key. Richard was whistling to himself again as they walked down the corridor to their room. He opened the door quickly. Inside, standing at the window, was Herr Kronsteiner. Richard's whistling stopped. "Good evening," he said quietly. "I came to leave your account in your room," said Herr Kronsteiner. "I took the opportunity of waiting so that I could explain any details which might seem doubtful." "Of course," said Richard. Herr Kronsteiner held 2 envelopes in his hands. He chose one of them carefully and handed it to Richard, who ripped it open. Frances saw a shade of disappointment pass over his face. The envelope contained an ordinary bill, followed by the name of the proprietor, Rudolf Kronsteiner. In his mind, Richard saw Fugger's head against the dusty row of books, saw the scarcely moving lips. "The owner," whispered Fugger, "is called Hans. He will help you." "Thank you," said Richard. Should he risk it? It was now or never. The next step was his to make. He was amazed at the calmness of his own voice. "Except, of course, I thought you were the proprietor." "I am," the man answered gravely. "Really? I thought the owner's name was Hans." Herr Kronsteiner smiled. "Gott in Himmel, how could I have made such a mistake? I gave you the wrong bill. My apologies, Herr Professor." Richard smiled too as he read the second bill. "Everything is quite clear now," he said. "Would you like the bill paid this evening, or will tomorrow do?" "All accounts must be paid each Monday," replied Herr Kronsteiner. "One more thing, all the rooms in the hotel have been reserved for a political conference this week. It begins on Wednesday." "We intended to leave Innsbruck tomorrow." The reply pleased Kronsteiner. He had given his warning, and Richard had taken it. Later that evening, as they crossed the square, Richard chose the moment of isolation to tell Frances they would leave tomorrow for Pertisau am Achensee. They reached the pavement and walked in silence towards the cinema. Outside, Frances paused to look at the stills. "I think I'd rather have a drink," she said. "You've got sense," an American voice said behind them. Van Cortlandt. He shook their hands as if he were really pleased to see them. "Drinks are on me," he said. As they walked towards the restaurant, there were explanations. He'd finished his assignment in Germany and was heading towards Vienna. Frances filled in the gaps with girlish gossip. As they sat at the table in the beer house, they all relaxed. The men ordered steins, and Frances left the conversation to watch the people around them. She noticed a young man sitting alone at a small table and making the best of his splendid isolation. He was vaguely familiar. He looked suddenly towards them, and his eyes met hers. "Anything wrong, Frances?" asked Richard. "I'm just thinking, is that the young man from the train? Your friend's brother, Thornley?" The young man decided everything by looking towards their table and smiling wholeheartedly. Richard gave a wave of his hand, and the young man rose and came towards them. Van Cortlandt looked at him. It was a quiet summing up. Thornley pretended to be unaware of it and sat down beside them. He was amusing and seemingly light-hearted. Frances watched Van Cortlandt make up his mind. After he had had half an hour of Thornley, she felt the judgment was favourable. "Where's your friend?" Richard asked Thornley, when the rush of conversation offered its first pause. "Tony? Oh, he should be here any day, I hope. We didn't find ourselves very welcome by the authorities. It seemed easier if we split up." "Run into trouble?" asked Van Cortlandt. "A little," said Thornley. "Actually, Tony is looking for a girl. He met her in England last summer. He had the idea of marrying her and getting her out of the country as a British citizen. I'm just waiting for him and his girl to arrive. I said I would wait until the end of July." Richard ordered more beer. "Well, we are leaving tomorrow," he said. "For Pertisau." Frances blinked her eyes. It was hardly the change in conversation she had expected. "If you both can make it, then turn up any time you feel like it. We'll say at the Hotel Post. There's always a post in Austria." They rose, straggled to the door, and parted with a good deal of warmth. Frances watched the American and the Englishman walk away together, still talking their heads off. "I wonder if they'll come. Won't it complicate matters?" Richard shook his head. Frances had the dawning suspicion that he was going to leave her under the young men's protection. She would see about that. Over a late breakfast they made their plans. Frances was suddenly demanding action. She wanted to get to Pertisau as soon as possible. "Did the second bill tell you whom we are to see?" "We are to find a Dr. Mespelbrunn, a chess collector. Welcomes any fellow enthusiast. It should be easy getting in touch with him." By the time they had walked back to the hotel, the luggage checks awaited them. They left more than the usual tip for Johann, and made their way to the station. It wasn't until they were in the train watching the pleasant valley spreading out before them that Richard actually relaxed. There would be good walking and pleasant climbing, he thought, with some satisfaction. Even the fact that the Hotel Post had no accommodation could not dampen his spirits. The manager of the hotel was sorry, but there were no double rooms vacant. If they would consider a room in one of the villas... So they left their luggage at the hotel and followed the manager's assistant across the road to a house. It seemed both clean and comfortable. They climbed the Barenjoch the next day. As Richard had said, it was easy, and it was also useful. He spent a lot of time on the peak, studying the lie of the valleys which met in the green plain of Pertisau. If they were to follow the stream up around the jut of the mountain into the valley which it sheltered, they should find Dr. Mespelbrunn with his chessmen. Frances watched Richard. He was interested in the mountains, which stretched into the distance, in rough-tongued waves. "Looking for a quick way out?" she asked. "It wouldn't do us much good in that direction," said Richard. "That's Germany. I wish to heaven that Pertisau had tucked itself near the border of a nice healthy place like Switzerland. Still, even if we have to make a dash for it, it's just as well to have a choice of directions. Yesterday I was worried because Pertisau was such a bottleneck." "You seem to expect fireworks. It's difficult to think of any danger or evil lurking in this kind of place." Frances settled down on Richard's Burberry and fished for a cigarette in one of its pockets. She lit it and lay back to look at the sky. "How are we going to do it?" she asked. "We'll just walk in and ask if we dare have the honour of seeing the chess collection," replied Richard. "We shall blow in, probably on Thursday or Friday, when Pertisau has looked us over and accepted us." "I'm looking forward to meeting him." Are you definite about that? Quite. You aren't going to leave me out at this stage? You know, I keep worrying about poor old Fugger. I wonder if he did get away. If he hadn't, we wouldn't be here, or we should have been continuously followed until they could catch us with another agent. Don't worry about Fugger. He's a wily bird. Richard suddenly sat up and watched the mountainside. I thought I heard voices, he said. He was right. Below them were 2 men. Frances rose to her feet. The 2 figures paused and then waved their arms. It's Van Cortlandt and Thornley, she announced. You know, I never thought they'd come. Richard got up and waved back. The 2 of them seemed to be in good spirits. At last they came over to the last piece of rock and dropped on the ground beside Frances. This, said Van Cortlandt, with as much pride as if he had been fishing for marlin, is my first mountain. We are overcome, said Frances. It was a most spectacular appearance. We motored from Innsbruck this morning, said Thornley. We found the hotel and then your house. A nice old thing told us you were up here. It looked easy, so we came. Well, have a sandwich, said Richard. We're glad to see you. As they ate, they explained further. The pavements of Innsbruck had become hotter and harder after the idea of Pertiso had been put before them. Van Cortlandt felt a holiday was due him, and Thornley was bored with being bored. It's the first real vacation I've had in 2 years, said Van Cortlandt. I'm always either going someplace or coming away from it, and I've always got an eye open and an ear listening. I'm going to forget all that for 3 days. I'm going to have some peace for a change. That night, the promise of Innsbruck was kept. They enjoyed themselves. By the time they had finished dinner and had gone into the hotel lounge for coffee, most of the other guests had disappeared. They must need their beauty sleep, suggested Frances, and giggled. She was in rather good form tonight. She had been worrying during the last 2 days that if the 2 men did come to Pertiso, perhaps the party would be a failure. But everything was going well. She looked at Van Cortlandt, leaning forward to catch Thornley's words with a smile on his lips, a smile ready to break into a laugh when the point of the story was reached. Richard was lighting his pipe contentedly, his eyes on Thornley. It was when they were all laughing that Frances noticed the man. He sat alone at a small table, a dark-haired man with bold black eyes, heavy eyebrows, and a prominent jaw. He was probably about 30, guessed Frances, and already his muscles were running to fat. His eyes were fixed on Thornley. They suddenly swung round to Frances and became aware of her scrutiny. Frances let her eyes pass over him, fixing them on the deer horns just above his head. She held them there until he had stopped looking at her and walked loudly out of the room. Van Cortlandt had noticed the last few moments and was watching Frances with a smile. "That's one of the boys in the back room," he said. "Don't tell me the Gestapo finds its way to a place like this," said Thornley. "They'll find their way to any place," replied Van Cortlandt sourly. "Not one of the pleasanter types of humanity," summed up Thornley. They all agreed on that, and rose. The 4 of them linked arms and walked in unison towards the hotel. As Frances and Richard said good night, Van Cortlandt looked as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He seemed worried. On Friday the mists were on the mountains, and the waters of the lake looked grey and uninviting. Van Cortlandt was disappointed, for this was his last day. On Saturday he had to meet a radio man in Innsbruck who wanted some impressions from him for a broadcast to America. Thornley thought it would be better if he motored into Innsbruck with Van Cortlandt. "It's a pity you leave today," said Frances. "There's a dance this evening. Frau Schichtel, the owner of this hotel, told me about it this morning and said very pointedly that we would be welcomed." "That's rather strange, considering their German cousins are all over the place. You would think that we outsiders would be avoided like the plague," said Thornley. "It was quite the opposite," replied Frances. "Frau Schichtel was eager for us to go and meet the real Austrians. She offered me the Sunday dress her daughter used to wear. She really is awfully decent." "Where is this daughter?" asked Van Cortlandt, sensing a story. "She is dead," replied Frances. "Some years ago she went to Vienna to study singing, but instead of becoming a great singer she fell in love and got married. He was an active social democrat, and then the Nazis arrived. The husband's name must have been on their blacklist. They said he committed suicide. Nothing more has been heard of the girl." "She may not be dead," said Van Cortlandt. "Frau Schichtel hopes she is." There was silence. The truth was that there was no peace of mind left for anyone. Frances and Richard left their house at 3:00. As they passed the hotel post, Thornley waved to them from the doorway, but he made no move to talk to them. As they entered the road which would lead them up the river Pletzach, Frances glanced over her shoulder. Thornley was still standing at the hotel door, his hands in his pockets, and she had the feeling that he was making a very good pretence of not watching them. That gave her a comforting feeling. It was just 3:30 when the road, now scarcely broader than a cart track, curved round the foot of the hill. Richard had chosen to approach Dr. Mespelbrun's house quite openly and directly, so that if it were being watched, their reason for the visit would be believed. The house was planted neatly in the middle of a broad green meadow. It was a small house, sturdily built, with the usual overhanging eaves and a balcony encircling the upper story. The heavy front door was closed. Richard knocked, and as they waited they looked at the stretching valley below them. The rain clouds of the morning had disappeared, and the sun warmed the stillness all around them. They heard the door behind them, and they turned to face a woman. She was past middle-aged, large-boned, with the impassive face of a peasant. "Good day," Richard said. "Is Dr. Mespelbrun at home? I'm interested in chess collections, and I've been advised to visit." The woman was still silent. A man came out of the shadows. "Dr. Mespelbrun?" he asked. His voice had a hoarseness which coarsened his accent. He pushed the woman aside and stood in the sunlight, with a smile on his dark face. It was the man who had watched them in the hotel post 3 nights ago. He was as swaggering as ever, as he held the door open wide and bowed them politely into the house. They found themselves in a large room, a mixture of sitting-room, lounge and study. "If you wait here, I'll get Dr. Mespelbrun." The man left them abruptly, his heavy heels sounding on the hardwood floor with a precision that grated on Frances's nerves. She exchanged looks with Richard, but neither of them spoke. She had hated this man at first sight. Still, they must see Mespelbrun before they passed judgment. They heard footsteps outside. A man's voice spoke as if to a dog. It was only a short command, but the words were English. Frances sat down in the nearest chair and tried to look calm. She started to count the steps in the staircase at the end of the room. She had reached the 9th step when the door opened. They both started in amazement. The tall man who had entered was equally taken aback. He recovered himself before they did. "Well, really," he said in perfect English, "this is a pleasure." Richard smiled. His eyes were calm again. "How extraordinary to meet you here," was all he said. The Freiherr Sigurd von Aschenhausen moved quickly over to Frances and bowed low over her hand. She smiled, but inside she was angry. An Englishman indeed, with that acute Oxford accent so carefully cultivated in his years of free scholarship. "We came to see a Dr. Mespelbrunn, or rather his chess collection. We were told in the village that it was the thing to do," she said. The German smiled. "Well, you've found him, you know." "Are you—" "But why on earth—" began Frances, and hoped that the laugh she gave was sufficiently amused. "Why take such a wretched name as that and give up your own perfectly good one?" "It's perfectly simple," said von Aschenhausen. "When I live here, I have to be very careful. It would be impossible to use my own name." He paused, but the Myleses only looked at him with polite surprise. "It would be too dangerous for me," he added, lowering his voice, but they still looked at him politely as if they expected him to go on. "You are looking very well," said Frances finally. "And you have a charming place here." "Yes, it is beautiful." "At that Oxford party, why didn't you tell me then you were coming here?" Richard entered the conversation. "We thought you were in Berlin, and it was pure chance that we did come here." "Charmingly quixotic," said von Aschenhausen. "And the most quixotic thing of all is that you should be Dr. Mespelbrunn," said Frances. "I expected to find a house filled with a remarkable family of chess experts, and yet here you are." "I'd still like to see the collection if I may," said Richard, looking amused. "I'm afraid it isn't here at the moment. It's being exhibited at Innsbruck." Von Aschenhausen looked as if he really were disappointed. And then he began to ask about Oxford. His visit this summer had lasted only for a day. He had had little time to find out about all his old friends. Frances could see where this line would lead him. So he was interested in Peter Galt, was he? She suddenly wanted to leave, but they couldn't do that until von Aschenhausen was satisfied. She looked out of the window. Her thoughts turned to Mespelbrunn. Where was he? Probably dead. Perhaps buried on the mountainside opposite her. She watched the sunlight strike on the dark, rich green of the fir trees. The afternoon was ending. Richard, by some feat, had switched the conversation over to the women's colleges in Oxford, and there it had stuck. There was a sudden crash upstairs, and then the thuds of hollow blows. The noises ceased as startlingly as they had begun. Von Aschenhausen saw the surprise on their faces. He was suddenly casual and polite, smiling easily. "Don't worry," he said. "That's the dog. We keep him out of the way when we have visitors. He's very savage with strangers. He's almost due for his exercise." "Oh, we mustn't keep you then," Frances said. She had already reached the door. As von Aschenhausen opened it for them, they heard two other sounds from upstairs. Weaker sounds, much weaker. They ignored them and said their goodbyes as if nothing had happened. When they gained the road, Frances took a deep breath. Richard was lost in thought. He seemed to be watching the road as if he were trying to remember something. "It's just about here, I think," he said, as if to himself. "Just about here that the shoulder of the hill stopped hiding the house. We'll give it another 20 yards. The road twisted further behind the jutting hill, and as it passed through a fringe of trees, Richard suddenly pulled Frances up the short, steep bank into the shelter of the branches. Her surprise held her silent. Richard looked back over his shoulder, and then relaxed his grip on her arm. "The hill hid us, and they couldn't follow us yet, not with the road so open as it is." Richard put one arm around her shoulder and kept his eyes fixed on the road. "Frances, what did you think when you heard the noises upstairs?" "Well, it could have been a dog," she said. "A big dog. Peculiar kind of dog it must have been." "Do you think it may have been our man?" "Yes," said Richard. There would have been no hope for him if he had heard German voices. "What on earth can we do, Richard?" This was something which Peter Galt had not thought of. They should either have met an Englishman or found he was dead. Not a hopeless complication like this. Richard drew a slab of chocolate from his pocket. "Eat some of this," he suggested. He looked at his watch. "It's well after 5 now. We had better wait a bit. If any chance comes, we'll seize it. If not, I'll take you back to Frau Schichtel's and come back here myself tonight. I'd like to look around. Henry may carry a gun. If so, I'll borrow it. If not, then I've always got my stick." He patted the Basque stick of rough wood, with its round leather handle and its sharply pointed ferrule. It didn't look much protection. "I never showed you this," said Richard. "It's rather gruesome." The head of the stick slipped off, and a wicked 8 inches of pointed steel emerged. It was firmly fixed to the rest of the stick, and transformed it into an ominous weapon. Frances looked at him incredulously. "And I've looked at that stick for years," she began to giggle. She recovered her seriousness. "How long are we going to stay here, and what shall we do?" "Let me do the worrying, Frances," he replied. It could only have been 10 minutes later when Richard's arm tightened round Frances and pushed her quickly flat on the ground. It was the black-haired man cycling towards Pertisau with a wolfhound at his heels, and then he was out of sight, the trees hiding him from Richard's straining eye. Richard relaxed his grip. "So that leaves only von Aschenhausen," he said with some satisfaction. "Come on, Frances." The climb was more difficult than it looked from the road, for there was no path to lead them over the easiest ground. They paused for breath while Richard scanned the ground above them. It would be slow work. Frances was standing very still. "Down there," she said. Richard followed her eyes. The valley beneath them was no longer empty. Along the road which led from Pertisau, a man was riding a bicycle. "I wonder what he learnt at Pertisau to send him back at this rate," said Richard. They started to climb the last stretch of hill. The path was apologetic. At best, it was little more than a foot broad. At its worst, it effaced itself altogether under slides of stones. As they crossed these slowly, Frances held her breath. She suddenly stiffened. "Richard, down there, near the trees. It's the dog." Richard grasped her wrist, and the strength of his hand calmed her. "So he did see us," he said. The dog, bounding up the path towards them, stopped and was looking backwards. When 2 men came in sight, he again bounded on. It was von Aschenhausen and the black-haired man, their hands deep in their jacket pockets, their eyes searched the hill around them. Von Aschenhausen left the path and began to climb directly up the shoulder. His plan was to encircle them, obviously. The black-haired man was plodding steadily up the path to the saddle where they lay. The dog bounded ahead. Richard and Frances backed cautiously from the sheltering rocks and raced back over the gently sloping ground. They curved round a mass of rock and saw that the narrow gorge before them suddenly ended. To their left was the open mountain, to their right a landslide. They were neatly trapped. And then, behind them, they heard the panting of the dog. Even as they turned, it gathered its muscles to spring. Frances was nearer. "Flat on your face," came Richard's voice. She was hypnotized as the animal, now more wolf than dog, hurled its huge weight down at her. She felt it pass above her body, striking something beyond. She raised herself on an elbow and turned her head. The dog was spitted on the steel goad of Richard's stick, the 8 inches of steel firmly embedded. With a grimace of disgust, he put his feet on the dog's chest and pulled. The stick came out, slowly. "Through here," he whispered, pointing between 2 boulders. Frances obeyed. The fear which had paralysed her legs suddenly left her. All she felt now was anxiety. It was a shock suddenly to see the dark-haired man only 10 feet away. Frances remained motionless behind a rock. If he had seen her, he ignored her. His eyes were fixed on Richard. The 2 men stood scarcely 20 yards apart, looking at each other. There was a smile on the man's face. He was like a cat playing with a mouse. He lifted a revolver slowly, slowly. Frances raised the heavy stone she had gathered in her 2 hands and threw it with all her strength. It caught him between the shoulder blades and sent him staggering forward. He twisted quickly round to shoot. Frances saw the rock splinter beside her, then heard the crash of the revolver. It was then that the man realised his own danger. There was nothing on the sloping edge to grasp except loose stones. He was clutching one in each hand as he slipped over the precipice. His scream fell with his body. And then they were running, carefully but steadily across the slopes and down the path. There were no sounds except the muffled pad of their feet on the path, softened now with pine needles. The trees were thinning. There was a little more light, and they were passing the edge of the meadow and the track which led to the house. Down there, in front of them, were the bridge and the road itself. Then Richard caught Frances tightly. Through the quickly falling dusk they could see a car on the roadway, and 2 men talking beside it. "What's wrong, Richard? Don't you see who they are? It's an American car." She was right. They started forward again. "Hoy!" called Richard softly, and the men turned round in amazement. They ran over the bridge to meet them. "Well, I'll be," began Van Cortlandt, and then stopped as he looked at them. Richard pushed Frances into his arms. "Get her into the car and look after her. Park off the road. Keep the lights off. Be ready to start at a moment's notice. Bob, I need your help. Are you game?" Thornley took his eyes off Frances's face and her ripped cardigan. He nodded. "I'm ready," he said, and moved off after Richard. Van Cortlandt watched them go towards the dark house. "Now what's all this about?" he said. Frances's story was slow and halting. Van Cortlandt listened attentively and patiently, his eyes trying to see her face in the darkness. There was a note in her voice which held him silent through the long pauses. "Well," he said, "that was quite an afternoon you had yourselves." "You know I haven't asked you how you came to be here," said Frances. "Bob saw you start off, and when you didn't get back before 6, as you had promised, he got worried. So we hung about, and then the black-haired guy arrived on his bicycle. Just then the hotel man came out and stopped to speak to me. He said we were late. I said yes, that you hadn't got back yet. At that, the black-haired chap got onto his bicycle and went over to Frau Schichtel's. I didn't like that. I liked it less when he must have found out you weren't there, because he shot past us and went right back in the direction he had come from." They were both silent. "I'm tired," said Frances suddenly. "Poor kid," he thought. He slipped some gum into his mouth and settled down to wait, with his gloomy speculations for company. What interested him most in Frances's story were the omissions. Richard and Bob Thornley moved towards the house, which was silent as a tomb. Thornley looked at the balcony at the side. He grinned. "Easy meat," he said. He swung himself up easily from the windowsill and took hold of the balcony, pulling the rest of his body up slowly until he could swing a leg over the railing. As Thornley disappeared silently over the edge of the balcony, Richard kept close to the shadow of the house. He waited. The minutes seemed like hours. He thought he heard a shutter being forced open, and then a window. Just as he was thinking of the easiest way to get up, he heard Thornley's voice above him. "Here, lend us a hand." He was supporting another man. Richard watched Thornley help the man over the railing and then lower him, holding onto the man's wrists. Richard braced himself to take the man's weight as he dropped. Richard caught him, and they rolled together on the grass. Thornley landed down beside them and helped them to their feet. "Winded?" he asked the man. "All right, thanks. Neat job." He stood up shakily. "Who was here this afternoon?" he asked. "I was. "We'd better start for the car," Richard said. Thornley turned to sprint ahead. Richard put the man's arm around his shoulder and held him at the waist. Together they walked slowly towards the path. The man might have been 30 or 50. He was of medium height and thin. His hair was mouse-coloured. His eyes were nondescript. His voice had no marked accent. "You look as though you met trouble," said the man. "Complications. I left my wife in the car, with an American, a reporter. If he asks questions, I'm Smith, who helped escapes from concentration camps. Which is true, anyway." "Who's the other? Our blonde Tarzan?" "I know his brother." "I'll be Smith for him, too." "How did they get you?" Richard asked. "The man who posed as Mespelbrunn was supposed to be in sympathy with the underground movement. Got at me through them." "How were Nuremberg and Innsbruck, by the way?" "Nuremberg had to make a run for it. Innsbruck was getting suspicious about something," said Richard. "I'm glad you're alive." "There was a lot of information they thought I could give them. I couldn't give it if I were dead." Smith had taken charge once in the car. His voice cool and impersonal. He spoke to the American. "Take the car to the south end of the shore road. We'll wait there." He turned to Richard. "Is there more than one entrance to your hotel?" "We're staying in a house. I think Frances and I could both go. Quicker if there were two of us." "Don't forget money. With ordinary luck, we've got about an hour's start." They slipped out of the car into the blackness. Richard put his arm round Frances and walked her over the grass to the house. There was the usual weak light in the downstairs sitting room. It was Richard who shut the windows, drew the curtains, and lit the 2 candles. He didn't risk a brighter light. He poured water into a basin and carried it over to where Frances was sitting. He helped her pull off her tattered clothing. As she cleaned the cut on her shoulder, he bathed her feet and legs. There was a knock at the door. Frau Schichtel's voice said, "May I come in?" They looked at each other in dismay. Again, there was the same timid knock. The door opened. Richard rose to his feet. Frau Schichtel came in, closing the door quickly and quietly behind her. Her kindly face was clouded with worry and fear. She came over to Richard, took the sponge gently out of his hand, and knelt down beside the basin. "You must bathe your own leg, Herr Myles. It is cut very badly." Frances smiled gratefully, and then grimaced as Frau Schichtel tended to her wounds. "We got lost on the hills," she explained. "I think you are in trouble," said Frau Schichtel. Richard said nothing. Frances slipped into the dress Frau Schichtel had given her. "It is so very pretty, Frau Schichtel. Perhaps I shouldn't wear it." "It is your dress now. I have no more use for it." Frau Schichtel moved to the door. Richard watched her tensely, but the sad smile on her face was honest and friendly. "Is it these Nazis?" she said. Frances nodded. "I knew it. Ever since that rough fellow came here so rudely this evening, they must not catch you. Not as they caught my daughter." "If we hurry, we shall be safe," said Richard quietly. "When you leave, go out through the kitchen and the back door. I shall hand you bread and cheese. I wish you a good journey to a safer land." The bedroom door closed gently. Frances looked as if she might cry. The light was still on in the sitting room, but the curtains had been drawn so that they could cross the room safely to the kitchen. It was in darkness, and the back door was open so that they could see the stars in the sky beyond. In the shadow of the open door, Frau Schichtel handed them a large package silently. They didn't speak, but their hands caught hers and held tightly for a long moment. And then they were gone. The car was entering the village of Jenbach, running down through the steep street with its motor silent. Smith was watching carefully. "Just at that corner," he said to Van Cortlandt. "Beside the road with the trees. The station is just to the left." He turned to Richard. "I think you should go to this address in Innsbruck. They'll see about a passport." He scribbled some words on a page and handed it to Richard. "I seem to have caused you a lot of trouble," Smith continued. "But perhaps you'll find some consolation in the fact that I have discovered something quite valuable." The car slowed down. It paused for a moment, and they saw Smith's shadow mix with that of the trees. He was walking, leaning heavily on Richard's stick, towards the station as the car swung to the right for Innsbruck. "You won't get far without plenty of dough," said Van Cortlandt, throwing his wallet into the back seat. Thornley caught it and added his share. "That will just about pay for the passport. You'll need more," he said. "I can cash a cheque at the bank tomorrow, then meet you at some place about 11 o'clock. Say, the Franciscan Church." "Thanks," said Richard, sincerely. "Now dump us somewhere just outside Innsbruck. We can walk to that address Smith gave us." "What if you run into difficulties in Innsbruck?" said Van Cortlandt. "We'll let you know. We can phone you. If we can't phone, then it's too dangerous for you to help us. You've been dragged into quite enough trouble as it is. There is, however, one very important thing, Henry. Send this message to Geneva early tomorrow. Reservations uncancelled, arriving Friday. And memorize this address. Got it? Good." The lights of the town gleamed in front of them. "I hate to spoil the party," said Van Cortlandt, "but there's a couple of cars on our tail. I'll slow up round the first bend. Get ready." "We'll say our thank yous in Paris or Oxford," said Richard. "Goodbye meanwhile, and remember the telegram." The car slowed up. They slipped quickly out and raced for the cover of some bushes. Safely hidden from the road, they watched the tail lights of Van Cortlandt's car streak towards the town. They waited for some minutes, and then they heard the roar of a powerful engine. A large black car, followed closely by another, flashed past them. Richard watched them disappear, after Van Cortlandt. The journey to the house was like a nightmare for Frances. Richard had kept their pace unhurried so that they appeared just two more walkers going home. The slowness of their steps increased her fatigue. The ill-lighted streets emphasized the darkness of the houses. Their silence sharpened every sound. It was less than a mile to the address which Smith had given them, but to Frances it seemed more like 5. Richard knocked as Smith had marked it down on the piece of paper. The door opened slightly. "Herr Schultz?" whispered Richard. The door opened wider, and a woman's voice answered, "In." Richard looked past the woman into the bare, poorly furnished room. A man laid his newspaper aside and watched them keenly from where he sat. "My name is not Schultz," he said finally. Richard became aware that he was still clutching onto the piece of paper Smith had given him. He pulled it out and handed it to the man. The man glanced at it and threw it on the table. "Who gave you this?" "A man from Pertisau." "Was his name Harold?" "No, Mespelbrunn." The man nodded to the young woman, and she closed the door. "Sit down," he said. His eyes were now alive, kindly. "Relax, relax. Are you hungry?" Richard nodded. The woman moved from the door into another room, probably the kitchen. "And how is our friend from Pertisau?" asked the man. "He is now well." "So he was ill?" "We thought so. We have not heard from him for a very long time." "Well, that is good news. What about you?" The usual. You mean to leave our happy fatherland? Well, it can be arranged. How are you travelling? To Italy, probably by train, as quickly as we can. Of course, said Schultz. You'll have to go as Germans. Do you know the language? Richard nodded. I'll get you the right clothes. That will cost you extra, of course, but you'll find it worth every penny. He rose from his chair and went over to Frances. We must change your hair. It is too pretty, he said. Lisa, what colour would you make this hair? Black? The woman came back from the kitchen carrying 2 bowls of steaming soup. Not with these blue eyes, she said. Brown is less noticeable. Good, make it mouse brown. We can begin tonight, then tomorrow we can get the clothes and the papers, and then you will all be ready to leave tomorrow night. Now, eat up. The warm bowl of soup brought life back to Frances's hands. She held her fingers round it and felt the warmth steal into them. When Richard finished eating, the man began to cut his hair. Frances felt her eyes begin to close. She could not have risen if 6 stormtroopers had come thundering up the stairs. Frances awoke with a feeling of compulsion. She had something to do. She lay in the strange bed and looked around. There was Richard, his hair cropped like that of a child who has had a fever. Her own dyed a dull brown. She looked at the cracked ceiling. Why had she awakened? Her eyes fell on her handbag, which Richard must have brought upstairs. That was it, the money. A sudden fear that she was already too late to meet Bob Thornley urged her quickly from the bed. Richard's watch told her she had ample time. She kissed him lightly. He didn't even stir. She washed and dressed quietly, closed the door gently, and went downstairs. Lisa was in the sitting room. She seemed surprised. I thought you would sleep all morning. I must go out. I must get money for the journey. The woman nodded. Frances turned towards the door and walked to the end of the street. If she followed the tram lines from there, she would reach the Museumstrasse, and then it would be easy to find the church. It was the long but safe way, and she had plenty of time. The walk was not unpleasant. In the busier streets, she felt still safer. She was just another girl. At the corner of the narrow street, which led to the square, the traffic was heavy. Frances tried to avoid 2 women who filled the narrow pavement, and collided with a girl coming out of a shop's doorway. She was a tall, blonde girl, her arms filled with parcels. Frances halted in amazement, and then stepped aside. It was Annie, their cook, looking just as she had on her last night in Oxford. I looked at her too directly, thought Frances. She recognised me. As she turned the corner to enter the church, she looked back over her shoulder. Annie was still there. She quickened her pace and hurried up the steps of the church. She paid the admission to a man with heavily pouched eyes. At least that would prevent Annie from following her inside. She had never spent a penny more than she could help in Oxford. In the nave, she saw Bob Thornley. He was seated in the shadows, with a catalogue in his hands. It was good to see him again, looking so untroubled. As she moved slowly towards him, he rose, and they passed each other without a glance. The catalogue had been left on a chair. She sat down beside it, her wide skirts spreading over it. Slowly, without any visible movement, she folded it into her palm. It was done. It was over. She reached the street and slipped the scarf off her head. There was no sign of Bob, but there was Annie. She had seen Frances and was almost running across the street. Frances bit her lip. There were 2 stormtroopers standing in front of the church steps. If she avoided Annie, their attention would be attracted. The men had already noticed Annie's haste and were watching her with casual interest. Frances made her voice enthusiastic. Annie, I haven't seen you in weeks. How are you? "Quite well," replied Annie, looking at her in amazement. "Cheer up, Annie, you look so worried." Annie led her across the street towards the garden in the square. In the quietness there, she faced Frances. "I have been worried about you." "How?" Annie blinked back tears. "I knew you were here in Innsbruck about a week ago. My friend Johann is the handyman in the hotel where you stayed. He knew I had lived in Oxford, and he told me about the 2 English guests. Early this morning, the Gestapo came to the hotel. They asked very particularly about you and the Herr Professor. They seemed very angry." "Annie, I had better leave you now. It is too dangerous. Richard and I must leave Austria at once." Annie was silent. Then at last she said, "Johann could lead you over the mountains." "Into Germany? That's worse still." "He also knows the South Tyrol. He was born there." Frances was tempted. But she said, "No, Annie, Johann must not risk anything for us. However, if he could draw a map—" "I will bring it to you," Annie said eagerly. "Don't tell Johann that the map is for us. It would be safer for everyone." Annie said she could manage Johann, and repeated the address which Frances told her. She would slip the map under the door of their house, and then she would forget the address forever. Bob Thornley saw the tall German follow Frances. He fitted Richard's description: cheek slashes, fair hair, gold bracelet, von Aschenhausen. The man had made no attempt to catch up with her, and was walking at some distance behind her. That way she would lead him to Richard. Frances turned abruptly into an alley. She had seen him. Thornley watched as von Aschenhausen suddenly broke into a run, and a slow-moving motor car ignored all rules of traffic to cross over to him. Thornley cursed himself for ever imagining that the German would be alone. A short command had been given, and the car speeded into the alley. Thornley hesitated, wondering desperately what his next move should be. He followed a very narrow side street, which brought him suddenly onto the road which the car had taken. And there it was, just ahead, ready to drive off. The German with the scars was just getting into the front seat beside the driver. Behind was Frances, wedged in between 2 uniforms. Thornley, his eyes fixed on the disappearing number plate of the car, shook his head solemnly. Richard woke about 11 o'clock, and his worries began with the empty bed beside him. He dressed quickly, cursing his lateness. When he got downstairs, Lisa had reheated some coffee. It was black and bitter, but cleared his head. Richard sat and waited. Lisa was sympathetic, but calm. There was no need to worry. His wife's appearance was safe enough. But by 1 o'clock, she was anxious too. "Can I phone safely from some place near here?" Richard asked. She nodded, and then pointed across the yard to a house in the next street. And then the doorbell rang. Richard moved behind the sitting-room door where he could see into the hall. He saw Lisa open the front door slightly. Someone handed her an envelope, and he heard a familiar voice. "May I see the Herr Professor?" Richard was startled. It couldn't be, could it? "Annie," he shouted, "come in." Richard seized her arm and pulled her into the sitting-room. "How on earth did you get here?" For her answer, she took the envelope back from the woman and handed it proudly to him. He ripped it open. All it contained was a small diagram, a sheet of paper with a map and no names. "There's the Brenner," she said, pointing to a small penciled circle. "I thought it better not to write in the names. You will memorize them. That is why I had to see you." Richard looked quickly from the map to Annie. "How did you know we needed this? How did you know you would find me here?" "Frances, didn't she tell you?" "When did you see her?" "After she came out of the church, about 11:45. I reached my brother's shop just after 12. What's wrong, Herr Professor? Is she not here?" "No," he said gravely. So his fears had been real. Something had happened to Frances. He thought of Van Cortlandt and Thornley. He must get in touch with them at once. But what then? What then? He needed all his wits about him to find a solution. "Annie," he said, "could you go back to your brother's shop and wait there until an American and an Englishman come to buy climbing boots?" Annie left by the back door, and Richard waited for 2 or 3 minutes until she would be safely away, hoping against hope that Frances might suddenly appear. But she didn't. In the sitting room, Richard found Schultz at the table. Richard's words came haltingly. "My wife may have been arrested. They may trace her movements to this house." "Don't worry about that," said Schultz. "I had already decided to change my address." He nodded to a large envelope and a neat brown parcel on a side table. Richard opened the envelope. The document looked convincing. The photographs had just the right moronic look. "Courage," said Schultz. "It's the only real weapon we've got. A man can win when he still has his courage." Richard walked quickly through the deserted side streets, and he arrived at the back entrance of Annie's shop in record time. There was no one in sight as he opened the back door and walked into the storeroom. He sat down on the edge of a crate and waited. He heard Annie's footsteps approaching. "God be thanked," she said. The front doorbell rang, and they heard a cheery voice call, "Anyone here?" Thornley and Van Cortlandt. Annie went through to meet them. He heard them suddenly quieten and follow her quickly towards the storeroom. She locked the door behind them, and they were left alone, standing there looking at each other. Thornley spoke first. "They got her. It was the fair-headed blight at Aschenhausen. I did some digging and found out the address from the number and identification marks of the car. Secret police. They've taken her to Dreikirchen. I've arranged about a car," added Van Cortlandt. Richard felt suddenly angry. The German was playing a deep and subtle game. If he had taken Frances to Dreikirchen, it was because her arrest must be unofficial, until he had got information from her. Frances knew enough to compensate for the escape of Smith, and even that might be made temporary, if Frances could be persuaded. If Frances could be persuaded. On the road which led to Dreikirchen, 3 large black cars passed them in quick succession. They were filled with young men sitting uncomfortably erect, their faces white blurs under the uniform caps. Van Cortlandt heard a quick movement behind them, and turned to see Thornley looking through the back window. "One of these cars is the same one I saw this afternoon with Frances in it. Henry, if they have left Dreikirchen, it will be all the better for us." "If they left," Van Cortlandt said. Thornley looked at Richard's white, set face. "Brandy?" he asked. "We'll need it later," Richard said. "This is the track. Have either of you got a gun?" "I have," said Van Cortlandt. "So if we get into a tight spot—" He tapped his pocket thoughtfully. They waited in the quietness of the trees while Van Cortlandt locked the car. Richard turned and led the way up the hillside. It was a short climb. They paused on the crest, sheltered by the pines. Below them the hill sloped gently towards Dreikirchen. They could see 3 spires above the last trees. "I can do the scouting," said Thornley. "All right," said Richard. Thornley didn't waste any time. He was already moving quietly down through the trees. Richard and Van Cortlandt waited in the silence of the wood and watched the tops of the trees moving gently against the background of the evening sky. The strain was beginning to tell on Richard. He began to count the branches above him. Anything to keep from thinking. Thornley moved from the security of the trees and entered the kitchen garden. The path was too open. He pushed his way carefully and slowly between the thick shrubs and knelt down on the mouldering earth. He moved his head to let him get a clearer view of the front corner of the castle. He dared not push the sheltering branch any more to the side. There were men walking in front of the castle. There were 2 of them. They were armed. Thornley wondered they had not heard his heartbeats. He smiled grimly as he moved back towards the path from the kitchen garden. He looked at the kitchen door. Now was the time to move. And then the door opened. A young man came slowly down the path, his mouth stuffed with a large piece of cake. Thornley raised his torch. The young man pitched forward suddenly onto his face. Quite a neat punch, thought Thornley, dragging the man into the bushes. He hoped to God that Myles and Van Cortlandt had been watching. They had. They were moving quickly and silently. They found him examining the young man's revolver. "Cook next on the list?" Richard whispered. Thornley nodded. He motioned them to follow him. They stretched themselves closely against the rough wall and edged towards the kitchen door. Thornley slid the gun out of his pocket and held it by the barrel. The kitchen door opened and the cook halted on the threshold. He stepped out of the doorway, peering towards the darkness of the garden. "Hermann?" His thin, high voice rose. "I heard you. You can come in, Hermann." He sprawled forward as the revolver butt thudded dully against his head. He was a heavy man. It took the 3 of them to lift him back into the kitchen. Thornley locked the door, and they moved silently into the passage. They mounted the staircase, slowly, carefully. At any moment, Richard expected the door above them to open and a volley of shots to pin them against the wall. But it remained shut. It was only when they had reached the door that they could hear the voices from within. A man's voice, and then another's. Von Aschenhausen. "You will regret your stupidity. We shall catch Myles just as surely as we caught you." The voice was clearer now, as if the man's anger were becoming cold and cruelly calculating. "You fool! You stupid little fool! Don't you see I will find out? My patience is limited. Kurt, try some more of your persuasion." They had heard enough. Richard shoved both panels of the door violently open. In the flickering candlelight of the room they saw von Aschenhausen sitting on the edge of a large desk. His eyes were fixed on the other man, standing over Frances roped to the chair, as he himself paused in the lighting of a cigarette. The match was still burning, as Richard's full weight knocked him backwards. As he tried to throw Richard off, the grip on his throat tightened. He lay still, choking. Frances felt the hand of iron release her aching shoulder. She heard the flat sound of a hard fist meeting solid flesh, heard someone cursing loudly. She knew the voice. Van Cortlandt. And then there was Bob's voice beside her, and the rope stopped cutting into her breast and thigh. Bob's voice was telling her that she was not to worry. Everything was all right. So Richard must be safe. In front of her, she could hear the heavy breathing of 2 men as they fought, the half-groan, half-gasp from the man Kurt as Van Cortlandt landed his blows. She forced her eyes half open. She could see Thornley's face as a white blur, gradually steadying, shaping into lines she could recognise. He was watching the punishment which Van Cortlandt was dealing with a look of admiration and pleasure. Kurt kicked suddenly, viciously, and Van Cortlandt doubled up with a groan. Kurt was trying to gain a moment. A gun, thought Thornley. It came as he expected. But Thornley's revolver flashed first. The man lay as he had fallen. "How's that son of a bitch over there?" asked Van Cortlandt, his words coming in spasms. "Passed out a minute ago." It was Richard's voice. He looked down at von Aschenhausen, lying limply across the desk. He was unconscious, his arms sprawled inert. One hand fell over the edge of the desk, the other pointed helplessly towards the glimmering candles in their heavy base. Richard picked up the rope with one hand, still keeping a firm grip with the other on von Aschenhausen's throat. But one hand was not enough. Richard sensed his mistake too late. Before he could use both hands again, von Aschenhausen swept the branched candlestick in Richard's face. As he stumbled back under the weight of the blow, rubbing burning wax from his eyelids, he saw von Aschenhausen's hand come up from the drawer with a gun, and he heard the shots. Von Aschenhausen stiffened and slid grotesquely from the desk. His revolver thudded dully on the thick carpet. Van Cortlandt stood, smiling with a grim satisfaction, his still-smoking revolver pointed at the crumpled figure. For a moment they looked at each other. All safe. "Do you smell burning, any of you?" asked Van Cortlandt. Frances heard the amusement in his voice. It was true. The carpet was smouldering, and even as she looked, she saw the first sign of flame. As Richard held her, she had the same awareness of unreality which would sometimes grip her for a timeless moment in the middle of a dream, which would drag her back to waking and the hotness of a crumpled pillow. But this was no dream. The smouldering rug and the guttering candles and the two bodies lying so quietly on the floor were all as real as the burns on her wrists and the blood on her arm. "Regular Viking's funeral," said Van Cortlandt. "Too damn good for them." They walked in silence down the cool staircase. Behind them, they heard the indrawn breath of the flames. On the swift journey down the Brenner Road, Frances was conscious of the burns on her wrist, nipped by the cool air. She was so tired that the muscles of her body refused to relax. Thornley, unexpectedly gentle, tried to protect her from the twists and turns of the mountain road. In front of them were Richard and Van Cortlandt, both of them silent under the peaked hats they'd stolen. She watched them drowsily, and then closed her eyes. When she woke, she thought it was von Aschenhausen holding her shoulder, bending over her, but the grip did not tighten and hurt. It was Richard. Richard, trying to smile and making a failure of it. "Fran," he said, and kissed her. The car had stopped in the shadow of trees. The night air seemed mild, the ink-blue sky too beautiful. And Richard's arms were around her. She suddenly remembered Bob and Henry. "Where are they?" "Freshening up. There's a stream over there." Frances looked at the trees again. Dark islands in a sea of moonlight. "We're further south," she said. "Almost at Verona, darling. It's 1 o'clock, and all's well." In the swaying car, they made their last plans. They were brief. They were to travel on their German passports towards Grenoble. Van Cortlandt and Thornley, cutting back on their tracks, would drive through Lombardy until daylight made the car too dangerous. They would then get rid of it and make for the Swiss border. "Houses are getting closer now," said Van Cortlandt. "Better waste no time." Frances had regained her control. "I'm ready," she said. "We'll see you in Paris." "I'm sorry. This was all my fault. I've ruined all your plans." The American shook his head. "My plans were going to be ruined anyway." Thornley switched off the motor and turned to face Frances. "I have no plans either, Frances. Don't worry about that. I had a letter from my friend this morning." "Tony?" "Yes. He's on his way home to enlist." "And the girl in Czechoslovakia? Maria?" "Suicide," he said, too coldly. She said nothing, only remembering the look on Thornley's face when he had looked down at the man he had shot. He had spoken as if to himself, and the words had made no sense. Now they took shape. One for Maria. Frances leaned forward and touched Thornley's shoulder with her right hand, and then Van Cortland's. Richard helped her to step out of the car. "This isn't the end for any of us," he said. "It's just the beginning." They were all silent for some moments, and then Thornley switched on the engine, and the car moved into the night. Richard picked up their suitcase and gripped Frances's right arm. They walked softly through dark streets, guided by scattered lights. At last they saw the station. Frances pressed his hand to her breast and held it there.
Emma Currie was reading Above Suspicion by Helen MacInnes, and the producer was Emma Currie.